千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Daodejing by Laozi. As ever, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. Chapter 74. So as usual, I would like to show everyone what the chapter titles look like. This particular chapter has two titles in Chinese. And the reason why it has two is because chapter titles were a later addition to the Daodejing. Originally, the Daodejing was written with chapter numbers, but not chapter titles. So in later days, people have affixed chapter title names to make them easier to identify as a quick reminder of what the chapter is all about. And opinions differed, so occasionally you see the chapter with two titles instead of one, but most of them have only one title. This one has the title of the Master Executioner title, but also the Great Carpenter title for the chapter. And these are both metaphors. The Master Executioner and the Great Carpenter are just like the heavenly net of the previous chapter, chapter 73. They both reference the Tao, the way the Tao works, what you and I may call karma, or karmic mechanism, or the Tao of cause and effect today. It's just a different way to describe the same thing, and we're going to talk about these two metaphors in great detail. So let's talk about the chapter itself, starting with reading the chapter line by line. Daodejing 74. People do not fear death. How can they be threatened with death? If people are made to constantly fear death, then those who act unlawfully, I can capture and kill them. Who would dare? There exists a master executioner that kills. If we substitute for the master executioner to kill, it is like substituting for the great carpenter to cut. Those who substitute for the great carpenter to cut, it is rare that they do not hurt their own hands. So a couple of things right off the bat to mention. In most chapters of the Daodejing, when there's an I reference in there, it's basically Laozi speaking for himself, talking about his own perspective, his own thoughts and opinions on things. Here, it is actually an exception. It is not Laozi who says, what I can capture and kill those who act unlawfully. That's actually representing the perspective of a brutal ruler. That ruler will be the one to say, anyone steps out of line, I will capture them, I will kill them. So then who would dare to step out of line? So that's important to recognize. It's actually not the words out of the mouth of Laozi to represent his own thoughts, but he's describing how a tyrant would think about the prospects of ruling. What Laozi says is in the beginning 2 lines, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start by analyzing the repeating patterns in this chapter so we can identify where the section breaks are most likely at. With this one, if you start to scan the Chinese characters from line 1 down, you're going to see that there's no real repeating patterns among the first few lines. You can see that line 2 and 3 have the same length. They're both 6 characters in length, and then 1 and 4, line 1 and line 4, both contain 4 characters. And then line 5, back to 6 characters again. Then you can see that there's the same character at the end of line 2 as you can see at the end of line 5. But that doesn't seem to follow the typical pattern that we see in the Daodejing. If you recall the previous analyses on different chapters, a lot of times we have like an AB structure, alternating lines with repeating characters. In this particular chapter, we don't really start seeing the repeating patterns until line 7. Line 7 and line 8. I think if you look at them, especially the last 4 characters, you can easily see the repeating patterns there. In case you're having trouble with that, I'm going to go ahead and highlight them right now in red. So the Chinese characters highlighted in red to the left correspond to the English translation to the right, also highlighted in red. A master executioner that kills, and then below, the master executioner to kill. The even grammar in a Chinese sentence can vary depending on the context. Here you see one slight variation. So that's a repeating pattern, okay? And it allows us to identify a break in the first half and second half of this chapter. The first half is all about people fearing death. It starts out saying, people do not fear death. How can they be threatened with death? This is not a statement to say that most people do not fear death or people do not fear death, period. The first 2 lines are basically Laozi saying that, well, what's going to happen when people don't have a fear of death? And then going from there to what the tyrant thinks, what the oppressive ruler thinks. So that's the first half. Then the second half goes into the metaphor, starting with the master executioner, as you can see, and then it moves into the great carpenter. And now, with those being identified here, you can tell where the chapter title in Chinese comes from. The master executioner, and then the great carpenter. So the repeating patterns that you can see in line 9 and line 10, it's offset by 1 characters. And then the translation, as you can see, will be to the right, substituting for the great carpenter to cut, and then substitute for the great carpenter to cut. Again, a slight variation on the grammar that's contextually driven. Okay, now that is the second half. And then the bottom line, the line 11, the last line of this chapter, becomes the one and only concluding line to summarize the entire chapter. Then looking back on the first half, the upper half, you can divide it up into the question from Laozi, how can people be threatened with death if people do not fear death, and then dividing that from line 3 to line 6, which is what the oppressive ruler thinks. So we can put a line there And this will be a thin line compared to the thick line that identifies first half and second half, because these are both the two subsections of the first half are both talking about the fear of death and then losing the fear of death. So to help everyone see the flow, the top part is the question from Lao Tzu. Does deterrence really work? Does deterrence actually work? Specifically, the threat of death. Does that really stop people from doing things? That is the question from Lao Tzu. And then the second half of that, the second subsection of the first half, is the mindset of the tyrant. And the tyrant is the one who thinks, well, I'm going to set up this punishment, including death, and then I can capture the people who step out of line, and so on. Now, in the bottom half, that's where Lao Tzu comes back with the Tao perspective. So now you can see this particular chapter is starting with the Tao, which is questioning the whole thing about killing, going into the mindset, perhaps the conventional mindset that thinks that the threat of death can be very effective, and then going into the Tao again in the third section. So it's the Tao mindset, the conventional mindset, and then back to the Tao mindset. That's the flow of this particular chapter. And now that you see how the chapter is structured, it is time for us to go into the chapter line by line. So we're going to start at the beginning. That's line 1. Line 1 says, people do not fear death. And the line says, 民不畏死. So the pinyin is, as you can see there, and this time the pinyin is relatively accurate. So most native speakers of English can use the pinyin as a guide to sound out this particular line. Let's break the characters down one by one to talk about exactly what they mean. So the first character means people, which in this context would be subjects of a kingdom. In an empire would be citizens of the empire. The people. And then the second character there, that's the character for negation. So that just means no or not, or not having any, none, etc. Negation. The third character is the character for fear. And then the last character, a common character still in use commonly in Mandarin today, and that's the character for death, 死. So when you string the literal transcription together, people not fear death, the translation is people do not fear death. And we know, as we observe the world, you and I, just looking around, checking ourselves, checking the people we know, normally we do know, most of the time, most people do fear death. The instinct of self-preservation to continue living is a powerful one. So normally, the fear of death is very much present. So the question that Lao Tzu wants to ask is, what will happen if that is not the case? And before we get to line 2 is the question, how can they be threatened with death? Let's explore just a little bit about the reasons why they would not fear death. So I want to be clear on where we are being taken by Lao Tzu. Where is he going to? What's he driving at? I want to be clear, this is not referring to people losing the fear of death because they have become spiritually enlightened. This is not about that at all. This is talking about secular scenarios, not involving spirituality. It points to how, although people usually fear death, there are situations when that is not the case. So that's what I want to talk about next. What might be some possible reasons for not having the fear of death? Let's explore. And this is just a partial list. You can probably think of more. So think about extreme rage. What happens when people are in the grips of this extreme anger that blinds them to everything? So anger and rage will cause you to do things you would not normally do. In that moment of rage, in that heated moment, you may not even be thinking about death very much or even have any fear. You just want to do something about that anger, about that rage. So real life is complex. There are all kinds of possibilities. And now the possibility would be belief in a cause. So not necessarily anger or rage, not mad about anything, but just an extreme belief in something. And this cause could be anything at all. Again, human beings are complex. Real life is complex. There are all kinds of possibilities. People believing in a cause so much that they do not fear death. They would brave any danger to further that cause. And we can have all kinds of variations on those. And here's another major category, suicidal depression. What if someone is so suicidal, feeling so depressed, like no meaning, there's no meaning in life? What's the point of it all? When that is the case, you can easily see how someone would not have a fear of death. So these are all possible human emotions that we can be feeling. And then I have one more major category. This is sacrificing oneself to defend or protect others. And this is similar to belief in a cause, which is the second bullet. But I just want to point out that this can happen even when there's no specific cause that someone has subscribed to. There may not be a cult, or there may not be a belief in the pursuit of liberty motivating someone. It may just be self-sacrifice in order to protect another person. This could be a child, this could be a family member, a loved one, a friend, maybe sometimes even a complete stranger. Human beings do that occasionally. Again, real life is complex. We have to account for all kinds of scenarios, extreme desires for revenge, retribution, striking back, not really caring if you live or die, as long as you can strike back. So depression may lead to inaction, but it can also be other forms of manifestation emotionally. What if, because like a cornered animal, someone has become very desperate and therefore lashing out? That person will do anything to kill anyone in order to survive. In that moment, the fear of death is out the window. So just describing a whole bunch of different scenarios on why the death and the threat thereof and the fear thereof may not be anything that we can rely upon. So this brings us to the second line. The second line says, how can they be threatened with death? So the threat of death becomes useless if the fear is gone. And if you think about the scenario of the tyrant that wants to use that fear to keep people under control, well, when the fear of death is gone, that's when the tyrant starts to fear. So the tyrant fears the loss of fear. That statement may sound like a paradox initially, but I think if you see it this way, it makes a lot of sense. And we know, just by looking at history, that historically all rebellions throughout human history have this loss as a component. People are so fed up, they lose the fear of negative consequences, punishment, death, imprisonment, they just rise up in opposition to the tyrant. And this is also why capital punishment may not be a deterrent. If people lose a fear of death, they're not going to care about whether or not they will incur the capital punishment. And if you put these cases together and examine the psychological profile, the idea is pretty clear. The loss of fear has a liberating effect, and it can be good or bad. The loss of fear on the part of the people against tyrannical rule can have a liberating effect, freeing the people to rise up in rebellion. The loss of fear for someone intent upon murder has a liberating effect, so the murder will be carried out. So, in general, the loss of fear has a liberating effect. It'll unleash action for good or bad. So let's continue on to line 3. If people are made to constantly fear death. So let's talk about that. This is the section where Laozi pivots from asking the question, what will happen if there's no fear? Now, Laozi describes the mindset of a tyrant. And I would also say this would be a similar mindset that a lot of people have. So for instance, a lot of people would feel that in order to deter crime like murder, you must have the capital punishment as a deterrent. If you kill someone, we will capture you and kill you, and therefore don't kill anyone. Now, we're going to explore that in detail. But for now, let's continue with this thought. In the mindset of the tyrant, the first step is to instill fear. And what that really means is that because the tyrant is thinking you can control people through fear, so make sure they fear death and threaten them with death. And it will cause the tyrant to set up harsh punishment for crimes and to make that obvious, to make that public, to make that knowledge public, perhaps with demonstration, using some people as examples, and that punishment should be especially gruesome in order to instill that fear. So the focus will be on physical pain, torture, and death. Now, it is usually the unremarkable or incompetent rulers that will think along these lines, the unwise rulers. So let me just take a moment now, as you have seen from our previous discussions, that we want to look at the Daodejing not just advice to the ruler, but advice for us, kind of casting us in the role of sovereign rulers in our own lives. So how would this idea apply to real life, the life that we live? So the mindset of the tyrant to be very harsh and unforgiving, we see that with some people in our lives as well, that the same harshness, unforgiving harshness that some people have toward other people, it's a complete lack of empathy. So that's how we can map from ancient times to modern times. So there's going to be more and more examples of that as we go. I want to keep the Tao as applicable to daily life, your life and my life, as we possibly can. Okay, now let's go to line 4. I want to start out with the third character in line 4. That character is Qi. The pinyin is QY, And I know some people will look at that and maybe say kui, thinking question. Sounds maybe like that. But no, it actually sounds like chi with a ch. In the pinyin system, the q is always pronounced like ch. So qi, what does that mean? What is that character? In modern Mandarin, the meaning is unusual or strange. It's usually translated as strange. And in this particular context, this is the ancient context, not modern Mandarin. What it means here is a tangential meaning to the definition that's typically used in modern times. It means something that is out of the ordinary, that maps to unusual, but specifically outside of the acceptable limits, outside of bounds, like stepping out of bounds, outside the limits of what can be acceptable socially or legally. So that's what that character is. Keep the ancient context in mind. It's what happens when you step outside of the regular bounds, which makes you unusual. And that's the tangential meaning associated with this character. So now let's go to the line itself, line 4. Then those who act unlawfully. So now you can see why the translation goes to unlawful, because to be unlawful is to be stepping outside of the usual bounds of the law of the land. Now, to use qi this way is strictly in ancient times, no longer in modern usage, in that people will never use that character today to talk about someone who has stepped outside the legal bounds. So if we didn't know that, we'll look at this line, and the line seems to say those who do strange things. But now that you know the ancient context, the way that it was meant and taken into account linguistic evolution over 2,500 years, that caused some of the meaning to be distorted or to evolve into something different, and then rewind the clock back to 2,500 years ago, you see that the actual meaning is those who commit crimes. And therefore, this is translated as those who act unlawfully. This is once again from the perspective of the ruler who is treating the subjects in brutal fashion. Line 5, that ruler says, I can kill them, I can capture and kill them. So that's line 5. So you can tell this describes the ruthless pursuit of all who violate the law. And what is the law in the perspective of the ancient ruler? Well, the ancient ruler will say the law is whatever I say it is. It is whatever I want the people to do, whatever limits I want to set upon them. And therefore, those who violate the preference of the king, the brutal king, will be captured, and the captured are treated in brutal fashion and then executed. So this, unfortunately, in the ancient context, is the way that many tyrants throughout history operated. And never mind ancient China, this is the way that tyrants in all parts of the globe used to operate a long time ago. And sad to say, there are still pockets in the world where tyranny still lives, and therefore, this is still the situation today in today's world, in some parts of the world. Now, we want to be sure that we map what Lao Tzu says about the ancient rulers to what we live in today in modern times. So the ruler, the brutal ruler, the tyrant who thinks in that way, pursuing all those who displease the ruler, basically, that maps to a person that, as I mentioned, is harsh, lacking empathy, but also very dogmatic and inflexible. That is, there is no taking into account different situations, no extenuating circumstances, no considerations of any factors. That would be certainly ruthless in the ancient ruler. In a person, this is someone who does not understand shades of gray, internally or externally, someone who's very black and white in thinking. Let's go to the next line. Line 6. Line 6 says, who would dare? So the idea is to strike fear into the hearts of people and they will obey. So fear, you can see, is the dominant theme in this primitive concept. Everything from line 3 to line 6 is speaking to fear, utilizing fear, inspiring fear, and then make use of it. To the tyrant, from the tyrant's perspective, it makes sense. Of course, this should be done. It should be done in this way because it is the only way to wield power. And you can tell from our perspective that this is the incompetent ruler. The incompetent ruler must resort to fear. It is the only thing that the incompetent ruler knows. And this particular ruler does not understand that it doesn't work. It never works long term. When we map that into our lives, it becomes clear what one of the messages can be that we can extract out of this. So you, as the ruler of your life, you should also examine the role that fear plays in one's own life. So look at your interactions with other people. Have you unwittingly, inadvertently caused people to fear, maybe giving you the bad news? Are people reluctant to tell you the truth because it may set you off? We definitely see that situation sometimes. Sometimes the truth is not pleasant. Sometimes the truth is ugly. But sometimes the truth must be told. Now, if you are tending to have those tendencies to be harsh, to be angry, to hit the ceiling, fly off the handle, to lose your cool, and full disclosure, I think everybody has those moments. I know I certainly have moments like those, moments of rage. Now, when I cool off, when I calm down, I know for sure that the rage, the anger, is something that alienates people. It turns people off so that they want to have nothing to do with you. Now, in moments of anger, I'm not even thinking about that. And then later on, I regret losing control. So this is what we can extract from the chapter so far. Back to the ancient rulers for just a moment. They too oftentimes gave in to their anger, and because they were absolute rulers, there would be nothing to stop them. There would be no checks or balance. The absolute ruler, wanting to be brutal, would enact the most brutal killings at a moment's whim. So this was the situation in ancient times. There is actually a well-known story to illustrate that. Let me share that story with you. It is a short story, something that we can do quickly, but we will do it completely to understand the meaning. So the title of the story is Tyranny, and this goes back to a long time ago, once upon a time in ancient China. During the warring stage period, Confucius and his disciples were traveling through the countryside near the Tai mountain. the Tai mountain, well known in ancient China. They were passing by a graveyard when they heard the sound of someone crying. They got closer to the source of the sound. They saw that it was a woman. She was grieving before a burial site. She seemed so completely lost in her grief, and Confucius immediately felt sympathy for her. He sent one of his disciples to approach her to find out what's going on. The disciple said to the woman, "Excuse me, we could not help but be concerned about your plight. It seems as if you have more than one tragic event in your family." And the woman acknowledged and confirmed this. She said, "Yes, that is true. Some time ago, my father was killed by the tiger. Then my husband also died the same way. Now, my son has been killed by the tiger as well." So this was certainly horrible. So Confucius asked, "This is obviously a dangerous area where we are at right now. It is not safe for human residents. Why do you stay here? Why did your family not move somewhere else?" The woman replied, "Although we have wild tigers in this area, we do not have tyrannical government. That is why we stay here despite the danger." Upon hearing this, Confucius sighed. He turned to his disciples. He said, "I would like you to remember this." He said, "Tyranny is more ferocious than the tiger. Tyranny is more fearsome, more horrible than even the tiger." So that is the story. And the full expression commonly used is that tyranny is more ferocious than the tiger. There are variations on it, like tyranny is fiercer than the tiger, but I believe more ferocious is definitely the closer expression to the original. Let's delve into the story to talk about what it means. A simple story, yes, but it has layers of meaning that we should explore. So, to start out, it is important to realize that during the time of Confucius, tyranny was common, and most of the people suffered greatly. And at that time, most people had no rights, no protection. Many tyrants at the time would oppress people through fear. Exactly the subject we're talking about today. They would force the people into slave labor, tax them until they had nothing left, let them starve, kill them at will. Because the people had no rights and protection, they were powerless to prevent this from happening. Many of them had nowhere to run, nowhere to escape, because the next kingdom might be just as bad. Sometimes people found remote regions sufficiently far away from any of the kingdoms, and this meant that they could live in peace and be left alone. They treasured this kind of freedom. They did not want to give it up. They would put up with any hardship, and as you can see in the story, even the threat of carnivorous predators, just to not live under a brutal regime. And obviously, they fear tyrannical oppression, far more than dangerous animals. This really touched Confucius because at that time, he was engaged in the work to advise the tyrants in an attempt to talk them out of their brutal ways, turn them into benevolent rulers. Certainly, Confucius was not the only sage who came upon the realization that tyranny is more ferocious, more fearsome than anything. All the sages throughout history, all the Tao sages, including Lao Tzu, recognized the horrors of tyranny and realized that it was completely contrary to the Tao. They all knew that even the fearsome tiger could not compare to a brutal ruler. Now, I want to share with you where this story came from. Those who study deeply into Chinese culture, ancient Chinese literature, know about the 4 books and the 5 classics. This story came out of the 5 classics. We previously talked about the 4 books. So what are the 5 classics? I don't think I've mentioned them before. Let me share with you what they are. In the image that you see in the slide, you see 5 books fanned out. These are the 5 classics. So let me go through them and talk about what they are. Now, the sequence of these books is not set, but we can talk about them. In the image, I can go from the right to left. Each one has a title, and it is written top down. So the first one in the slide, you can see the characters. Instead of top down, it's written from left to right. With the Chinese characters, you can write them from top down, left to right, or right to left. There's no strict rules that govern exactly which way it has to go. So the first book that you see there, let me share with you that it's called The Classic of Poetry. It's a collection of 305 poems, and it's subdivided into multiple types. And these poems were beautiful works of art from ancient times. People who study Mandarin, if they have an opportunity to dig into the classical poetry, I think it is easy to see that the ancient poetry collected there easily the most beautiful in the world at the time that they were written. Then the second one, second from the right, is the Book of Documents. What does that mean? What kind of documents? Well, these are documents collected from the ruling class, the rulers and officials. And these are the documents that they wrote or the speeches that they gave. They would write down a speech and then they would give a speech based on that. And those were collected in the Book of Documents. The third book is called the Book of Rites, a description of ancient rites, social forms, and court ceremonies. And because this had to do with court ceremonies, which is the rulers, this is where the story that we just heard came from. It's talking about how people see a brutal ruler, how they prefer a man-eating tiger to this ruler, to this human ruler. It's a reminder to rulers of the ages to watch what they do, to be compassionate as they approach the task of governing. Then, next to that is I Jing, the Book of Changes. Yes, I Jing, the first book about the Tao, is one of the 5 classics. So sometimes people think that the 4 books and the 5 classics are Confucian. Well, here you can see, well, it's got a book that is the first book about the Tao. In ancient times, certainly during the Warring Stage period, at the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu, They did not make a distinction between Taoism and Confucianism. Everything they studied, it was just the Tao. So it's important to keep that in mind. Then we have the spring and autumn annals. These are just historical records of what happened during a particular ruling dynasty. And certainly there are lessons to be learned from history as well. Here, by talking about the composition of the 5 classics and pointing out that I Ching is a part of it, so the story came out of the middle volume there, the Book of Rites, but in ancient times, it was all considered to be part of the Tao, and that's why we're talking about it. I want to circle back to even more of a Tao origin by talking about the way that Lao Tzu saw brutal regimes, tyranny. How would he describe it? Well, I was actually thinking that I would not talk about this until the next chapter, because in the next chapter, chapter 75, there is an exact description of exactly what Lao Tzu thinks. So specifically, Lao Tzu writes, this is a quick preview of the next chapter. Lao Tzu writes, the people's hunger is due to the excess of the ruler's taxation. So they starve. The people's difficulty in being governed is due to the meddling of the ruler. So they are difficult to govern. The people's disregard for death is due to the glut in their ruler's pursuit of life. So they disregard death. That bottom line there, that ending section there, that is exactly what we're talking about right now. At the beginning of chapter 74, it's talking about people losing their fear of death. While the people suffer, the rulers are enjoying luxuries, living it up. Of course, they would disregard death. It makes sense. So just a quick preview to let you guys know where we're going with this, and also to point out how we can link the chapters together to understand the overall meaning of the Daodejing. And then one more about this, just a quick review of everything that we have talked about so far. How does the tyrant think? Here is the mentality of the tyrant. It is basically setting up the rules to inspire fear. Create fear. Let the people fear death. Kill a few of them. The more brutal and gruesome, the better. Set an example. And then, if they step out of line, capture and kill them. So then, lastly, what we get is using fear to keep them under control. Then, what is the question from Lao Tzu in the beginning? Lao Tzu is basically pointing to this thought process and saying that, what is that so? What is the flaw there? Well, Lao Tzu shares with us that this scheme becomes completely useless when people lose their fear of death. So just like Confucius and all the other sages, Lao Tzu absolutely opposed the point of view from the tyrant, which you see in the top portion of the slide. So when the people have lost their fear, the threat of death loses its power. Suddenly, it is the tyrant who fears the people, not the people fearing the tyrant. So this is Lao Tzu saying to a tyrannical ruler, what happens to this plan of yours when people no longer fear what you have to dish out? What are you going to do? Bottom line, it will be much, much better to not be a tyrant in the first place. So this, I think, is a rather in-depth and complete discussion of the section we have just gone through, this is also a logical place for us to take a 5-minute break before we get into the second half of this chapter. We're going to explore line 7. There exists a master executioner that kills. The master executioner is the one in charge of killing, where this is the official duty. The executioner has the official duty to kill. And this is actually another way to describe the heavenly net from the previous chapter, Daodejing, chapter 73. Another way to describe karma. So the metaphor is execution of those who are reckless and foolish. In chapter 73, I think everyone probably still recalls that the beginning of that chapter talks about how the brave but reckless, the foolish, the unwise, who do not take heed of the situation but blindly charge forward, they are killed. So here it is basically saying that the Tao acts like sort of a executioner, a master executioner that will weed out those who are reckless and foolish. Now, in human society, we have executioners as well. Generally speaking, whether in ancient times or today, we have varying degrees of the legal and justice system that's taking care of determining who should be executed. And that is where capital punishment enters into our discussion. So in human society, the legal system handles this responsibility. We'll return to that, but only after we have described the Tao in detail. So far, this makes sense when we talk about how the thoughtless are killed. The metaphor suggests that the Tao is the executioner that kills them, but we know that they are in effect killed by their own hand, not by a malicious entity. What I mean by that is that they made the mistake of proceeding in a foolish way. So they decided to charge when things are obviously dangerous, so they charge to their death. They have no one to blame but themselves. But the functioning of the rules of nature is such that it is as if there's a master executioner who's just waiting for them, executing them for their crimes of being thoughtless. Now, overall, in human society, you can see the legal or justice system as a manifestation of karma as well. It is not a single person like a king, a monarch, who makes life and death decisions, but a system created by a society to safeguard itself. Someone who walks the negative path. That is, someone who is harming other people or society in general will be caught. In life, in your life and mine, someone who walks that negative path, even before committing criminal acts, will end up with karmic results. And yes, sometimes the karmic results can include death. So let's go a little bit further with this idea. We are now, in this slide, what I'm doing is that I'm highlighting the same characters that are both translated as the master executioner. The next step is to zoom in on line 7. There exists a master executioner that kills. So the recognition that we have is the recognition of both life and death in the eternal Tao. They constantly exist. The very first character in this line is constant. And constant is another, in the Daodejing, constant is another character to say eternal. So life and death, always around, eternally present, constantly there. And both life and death serve important roles in the eternal Tao. So let's take a look at some thoughts, ideas, and examples. As we observe nature, we notice how animals die and become nutrients for plants. They enable the plants to live and thrive with their death. We see farming, agrarian society, farmers plant their crops in springtime, harvest in autumn. So there's a beginning and an end for the crops. They grow through the months, and then they're harvested and stored away. So that is a mini duration as well of beginning and ending, just like life and death. Human beings are born, some will die of old age. So we ourselves have life and death. And I say some will die of old age only because there are quite a few who are killed before reaching old age. That the cause of death isn't old age, but perhaps accident, perhaps injury, perhaps killing, as we're talking about in this chapter. Either way, life and death, very much part of the picture for human beings. And then among human beings as well, the wise avoid danger, get to continue to survive, to live, to thrive. The unwise rush toward death, so they meet an early demise. So what we're talking about here is that death in nature, as well as life, serve important roles as rewards and punishment. Life and death provided impartially by the Tao based on actions. Acting wisely, we are rewarded with life. We survive, we live, we get to continue on. Acting unwisely, dangerously, recklessly, we're punished by death. It's not because the Tao hates us, it's because of our choices. So you can recognize easily that this is the heavenly net concept from the previous chapter. Nothing gets through the heavenly net. So nature gives life to all living things. It also kills living things when the time is up. The two are linked. As you can see here, I have the example of animals and plants. I have the example of crops. And this can be generalized. You can think about how winter comes, the plants wither. The animals seek shelter and some hibernate. When spring comes, the plants flourish. The animals become active again. The cycles of life and death continues. So same thing for human beings. We are not exempt. We are not apart from nature. Death, we know, creates room for life. Death, as a result of evolutionary selection, is the force that thins out the herd. So this is the reason for the character, the first character in the line, the character for constant, because the principle exists eternally. And really, when you look at it this way, when you think about everything that we can observe in nature, we see that the Tao, in the form of the master executioner, it really is the only thing that has the right to perform the quote-unquote execution as its duty. And this is just a way to say that nobody else has that duty. No one should interfere with this particular duty. Life and death in the Tao. Let's continue on. Line 8, it says, if we substitute for the master executioner to kill, well, to substitute means taking matters into your own hands. Like, I'm not going to wait for the master executioner to take action. I'm going to do it myself. So in the example of the tyrants that we had before, tyrants kill. Tyrants refuse to let the people who displease him to live out their lives. And how about the example of the vigilante? It's taking matters into his own hands, and therefore taking on the role of judge, jury, and executioner. We have many stories of vigilantes in popular culture, and you don't even have to be a tyrant or vigilante to, in some way, participate in taking matters into your own hands. If you support capital punishment, it actually fits into the category as well. So whether it's delegated to someone else, like a government official, to kill on behalf of society, that delegation doesn't lessen the approval or the support that you have given that particular approach, the approach of killing. You can take a specific action to mete out justice according to your personal judgment, like the vigilante, or you can approve of capital punishment, delegate the killing action to the hands of an official executioner. And that's why the term master, the metaphor of master executioner, is being used in this particular chapter. Laozi is making a distinction between Tao as the impersonal, impartial executioner, the taker of life, compare that to a human executioner that is acting on behalf of society or perhaps on behalf of the emperor. So here's the bottom line. Here's how we can see the whole thing. What is Laozi trying to say? Laozi does not approve of humans playing God. And by playing God, what I mean is making life and death decisions. Laozi is comfortable letting the Tao, the heavenly net, and the master executioner take care of those decisions of life and death, not human beings. So I want to make that clear. And then let's go to the other metaphor that's being used in this chapter. The great carpenter. The great carpenter is a reference to a master craftsman who cuts wood precisely. So I want to be clear that this has nothing to do with other religious traditions. Sometimes I hear people say the great carpenter referring to Jesus Christ because that was his work in the secular world according to the New Testament. No, this has nothing to do with that. This is just about someone who's skilled with the tools of cutting, who can trim and cut timber to exactly the dimensions needed for construction. So this can be a straightforward comparison, just a way to say that, well, you wouldn't want to substitute for the master executioner to kill, just like if you are unskilled, you wouldn't want to substitute for the skillful carpenter to cut. And when you do that, if you try to do that, the sharp tools is going to cut you instead of the wood. This could be just a straightforward comparison to say we should not kill on behalf of the master executioner. It's a valid way to interpret this line. Another way to interpret this line is to see it as another metaphor to describe the Tao, the heavenly net, and karma. The term can be seen as yet another metaphor to describe that entire process of cause and effect. So in that metaphor, the Tao is sort of the universal architect and builder. The world is a house being built by the great carpenter. Living things, including humans, are the building material, like a piece of wood. When the great carpenter cuts wood, when it trims wood, it is eliminating the unnecessary in order to build. So let's continue on. So let's talk about the piece of wood that is too long, not the right dimension. The great carpenter cuts it down to size. What does that mean? Well, it is similar to saying that those who cause harm to others will eventually meet their end. The Tao, karma, the cause and effect, will bring back the harm that someone has dished out back to apply to the person who dished it out in the first place. So cutting wood in this context is similar to evolutionary selection in the sense that if you are not fit to survive, you are weeded out by evolution. So the whole idea is a karmic consequence naturally circling back to its origin. And now we have enough information to put all the pieces together to pull the different metaphors that we have seen together in one place, so we can examine them as sort of a mini summary. Here's how it looks. The Tao of cause and effect, 4 ways to express the Tao. What do we have here? From the previous chapter, 73, we have the heavenly net. In this chapter, we were just discussing the master executioner, and now we're talking about the great carpenter. So we're using the interpretation that this is yet another metaphor. And then today, the term that we commonly use, even if you had no idea that these different terms are used in the Daodejing, you hear people talk about karma all the time. The source is various. Now, the original source will be ancient Hinduism. So the source today may come from Buddhism, which got that term from Hinduism. And it may just come from popular culture because the term has become very popular indeed. And I think we all understand what karma means. And it's fascinating to me to compare the ancient terms, the metaphors that Lao Tzu used. Back in the days of Lao Tzu, 2,500 years ago, no one in his time in ancient China had heard of Buddhism. That's because it was being created in India at that time. It was several hundred years later that the teachings of Buddhism was spread to China. So Lao Tzu was several hundred years too early to even hear about the term karma. It didn't stop him to talk about the same thing. He used these different terms, starting with the heavenly net. What is the concept? Well, you cannot outrun the negative consequences you create. Every fish will be caught in the net sooner or later because nothing gets through. So Lao Tzu says the heavenly net is vast, covers everything, but nothing gets through. So that's like saying that, well, you cannot escape your karma. Then in this chapter, we see the master executioner. What is the concept? Well, death has always been part of the Tao. The executioner is the entity that gives out death, so to speak. So those who are unwise or reckless will meet their end like prisoners executed by the executioner. So that's the concept. It is really the reckless, thoughtless abandon from individuals that cause the early demise. But the metaphor is being used that it's like being executed by the master executioner. And now we see the great carpenter, and we can apply the same reasoning to see what the metaphor is really all about. The Tao is like a skillful carpenter, knows how to use the sharp tools to cut wood. Those who move against the Tao are like pieces of wood that are too long. The carpenter cuts them down to the right size. Different ways to talk about the same thing. Finally, with karma, a term that we're all familiar with, and we're all familiar with expressions like, hey, what goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. The energies you put out, that you project into the world, well, it's going to circle back to you. It's going to be amplified many times when it comes back. That's karma. So all of these, I would suggest, are different ways, different lens to look at a single truth, the great truth of the Tao. Let's continue on. Line 9. Well, here we're talking about substituting for the great carpenter to cut. So what if humans try to take over this natural process? The work, the job that was done by the heavenly nets, by the master executioner, by the great carpenter, what if we try to take that over? So we know that certainly murderous tyrants kills on a massive scale, killing people rather than to let the natural process proceed as far as life and death. Vigilante certainly takes it upon himself to exact justice, which may include the killing. And then, in general, to kill is to trim wood like the great carpenter. And at the end of the day, when it comes to karma, we admit, we recognize that karma is created by the individual, and the elimination by karmic consequences, ultimately, that was created by the individual as well. And as I mentioned, the survival of the fittest, forces of evolution, part of nature, it already does that. It weeds out those who are unfit to continue to participate in life. So when we want to kill ourselves, killing and taking lives, basically you're assigning yourself the role of this natural process or the great carpenter to trim wood. And we have so much entertainment that fulfill this fantasy of taking on this role that, you know, the vigilante wronged by injustice goes out and exacts personal justice. We have so much of this kind of entertainment, revenge fantasy. So I am here today to talk to everyone in the hopes of uncovering the Tao perspective on revenge fantasies. Let's continue on. So still continuing on the subject of those who substitute for the great carpenter to cut. So as we talked about, the great carpenter is skillful. Human beings, not so much. We're not the great carpenter. We are not good at using the sharp tools of trimming wood. We're not so skillful. This is another way to say that we're not perfect. We make bad decisions. We make mistakes. We may kill the wrong person for the wrong reason. And because we are imperfect, the same imperfection is basically pervasive throughout all the systems that we create. Imperfect systems are created by imperfect human beings. And when I did a little bit of research on this, I wanted to see, well, how free are we from making mistakes in our justice system, in capital punishment? Well, I will leave it to everyone to conduct your own research, but I found that there is a horrifying amount of mistakes. That is, oftentimes, people who are being executed by this human-created system do not deserve to be executed. Maybe the wrong person. Maybe just bad timing, wrong place at the wrong time, and then meeting their end, be executed without necessarily deserving that kind of death. A huge amount of errors, truly mind-boggling. Let's continue on. Line 11 says, it is rare that they do not hurt their own hands. So due to the lack of skills, the substitute carpenter is likely to cut himself, doing damage to ourselves if we take matters into our own hands. In this context, hurting one's own hand has a number of implications based on the different ways that we've been seeing this line. For the tyrant, cutting his own hand by being brutal, well, it just means that the people rise up against him, bring him down. So the downfall of the tyrant is the tyrant's hand, is the tyrant basically cutting his own hand, so to speak. The vigilante, well, the vigilante is in fact a criminal as well, acting outside the bounds of the law. So the when the vigilante is arrested like a criminal, because, well, he is a criminal, he is actually cutting his own hand by exacting bloody justice against those that he thought were criminals. Now, I want to pull back from that perspective, look at the whole society, and also say that when there is capital punishment, society itself that condones, supports capital punishment, society also cuts its own hand. This follows from what Lao Tzu is saying. It's damage that society does to itself. And we have to be clear on this. This is something that's happening in reality. It's happening all the time. So use the visual metaphor from the Daodejing to help you come to grips with the whole idea. When you take the unfamiliar tools of the carpentry expert and you try to cut wood, you don't really know what you're doing. So, one slip and you cut your hand, your finger, and therefore, this applies to everything else that we're talking about in this slide. Even if you're not a vigilante, for you to exact personal justice, vengeance against other people, it just means that others will also, at a later time, seek vengeance against you. And when that happens, you are in effect cutting your own hand. Very important to be clear on all of the above. Let's continue. So specifically, when I say that society cuts its own hand with capital punishment, I want to bring your attention to the following. Number one, when we do that, when we condone or support, maybe enthusiastically, capital punishment, we're essentially doing what we condemn. We're doing the killing that we condemn as being the wrong and bad thing deserving of punishment. So we're not being true to our principles of being opposed to killing. We kill those who kill, basically. And it's inevitable. We end up with some wrongful executions. And as I mentioned, when I did my research, I realized that we end up with many wrongful executions. And then cutting off any possibility of remorse, of possibilities of making amends. I'll be the first to admit that it is unlikely, it is not often that there's remorse from psychopathic killers, sociopaths. They will probably live out their lives without ever feeling or capable of feeling any kind of remorse. That doesn't include everyone. However, there's always the possibility of remorse and making amends. The point here is simply that when you killed someone, you go from maybe a 1% possibility to 0 because that person is dead. And then finally, when we fail to establish the intended deterrence effect, we see that capital punishment actually doesn't have a reason for being. This is actually what Lao Tzu is pointing out at the very beginning of this chapter. Lao Tzu is saying that, well, what happens when people don't have the fear of death? You still have a deterrent? Well, it's an ineffective deterrent. So, as you can see, there is a lot to digest. There's a lot to chew on to figure out the meaning for yourself. And I leave it to everyone to form your own conclusions. I know, personally speaking, I was very much in support of capital punishment when I came upon this. And so for a long time, I had to basically agree to disagree with Lao Tzu, my sage. Now, over time, my thinking has changed. So now I am thinking much, much more along the lines that Lao Tzu indicated. And hopefully you can see his thinking in the explanations when we go from one line to the next, providing a deep level exploration for each one. So this brings us to near the end of our time today. I want to make sure we go to the summary. I have 2 summary slides prepared for everyone. I want to make sure that we go through both of them to summarize and also as a reminder. Starting with part 1, I think everyone recalls that when we went into part 1, it's all talking about the fear of death. So the first point that I want to get everyone to start thinking about is to understand the fear-based approach. For the ancient tyrants, the fear-based approach is to threaten the people with death. So in modern life, as I mentioned, the tyrant maps to the violent person, the angry person, the person who's prone to rage, prone to emotional outbursts, blow-ups. So I want to get everyone to think about fear-based approach. The tyrant wanted people to follow him by using fear as a way to get them to keep them in line. The angry person in modern times is using that anger as a way to get other people to conform. Number 2, I want to ask you to reflect upon your own personal approach to life. And hopefully, this is not something that describes most of us, but even if it doesn't, we can use it as a way to understand the people who are angry, who are often in a rage. So some questions to ask. Am I quick to anger and slow to forgive? And I know that hopefully in my case, that's not so much how I go through my day, not quick to anger, hopefully slow to anger, quick to forgive, the opposite, or just someone who eventually will get to a point who does not get angry at all. Now, how we know, how we can tell is by asking if other people walk on eggshells around me. Like, do they need to be extra careful or cautious when they interact with me because they don't want to set me off? And then the bottom line, how can I make sure I treat everyone with kindness? How can I make sure that I'm more my calm, level-headed, compassionate self? I want to be that person more often. So these are just suggestions for everyone to contemplate and reflect upon. Let's go to part 2. The part 2 of the summary covers the second half, which is about the metaphors, the master executioner, and the great carpenter. Here, the challenge that I have for everyone is to think about the natural processes that always include both life and death. Then the challenge is to let these processes take place without interference. Laozi is basically saying that it's always a bad idea to kill on behalf of the master executioner. We end up like trying to cut wood in place of the great carpenter. We end up hurting ourselves. So let's go to number 2. Cutting one's own hand. This is the practical part of what we want to talk about today. This is a topic that I'm going to return to next time as well. I'm going to emphasize this. As we go through life, we are going to encounter negative people. You have, and I have as well. The recognition here is that because of karma, because of the heavenly net, because of the master executioner and the great carpenter, negative people will invariably end up with their own negativity. It's coming back to them. So here, the challenge is to let go of any thoughts about getting back at someone. Revenge, retribution. The best way to get even is to live your best life. We're going to talk about this again, but basically, living your best life, the best way to do that is to live your best life in the Tao. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.